Welcome, everyone. Welcome to you that are here and the people who are watching online. We have a very special program, and it is most appropriate because we are in the 250th. If Dan even knew this when he scheduled the program, today is Martha Washington's birthday. She was born 295 years ago, and she was very important to George Washington. In fact, she was indispensable to him as he was to the country. So my name is Millie Henley, and the first thing we're going to do before I introduce Dan is to do our drawing for a great book prize. Am I supposed to? The last four numbers are 0, 4, 5, 7. That is correct.
Off.
You have a wonderful book here. It is the new book by Brett Baer. It is called The Case for America, an argument on behalf of our nation, where he's going to talk about why America is special. So congratulations. You're welcome. If you have ever heard any of Dan's programs, you know you're in for a real treat tonight. Most of you know that Dan is the leader of and the managing board member of EmpowerYouAmerica.com. Dan started Empower You 15 years ago with the simple idea to empower citizens by offering them free courses on important subjects. Empower You was started with the help of 8 other patriots from around the Cincinnati area: Nita and Roger Thomas, Nancy and George Bruneman, Bob Galbraith, Justin Bink Thomas, and Gina and Ed Bell. Since then, Empower You has offered over 600 free classes in person and online. Dan is an activist and is always interested in subjects about government and subjects where grassroots initiatives will help improve inefficiency. He has been active for years in Hamilton County politics with issues like eminent domain, the jail tax, union terminal, red light cameras, and transparency in government. Dan got involved with his friends Ron Albin and Jack Boyle in 2012 and was instrumental in helping end Ohio's estate tax, a blight on Ohio farmers and producers. Dan continues to advocate for educational choice and the right for parents to choose where their children go to school. Dan loves to speak to Empower You classes about subjects he is passionate about. In the recent few years, Dan has brought to life subjects like Sam Adams, Winston Churchill, President Theodore Roosevelt, and the War of 1812, among many others. He first grew interested in George Washington 5 years ago when a patriot from North Ohio gave him a book called The Bulletproof George Washington and told him of the story's importance to the country. The subject fascinated Dan for years until he finally decided that there could be no better time than America at 250 to bring to life the story of the Indispensable One, George Washington. It's my pleasure to introduce Dan Regenold.
Thank you. Thank you, Lloyd. And how about Millie? Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much for bringing to life that period of time for us. So I thought what I'd do is start tonight. I hope you had a chance to have a cherry dum-dum in honor of Washington cutting down the cherry tree. But the myth is he didn't really do it. There are a few other myths about Washington I thought I'd go over in case you... Oh, by the way, so good to have so many people sign up tonight online. We're really glad to have you. We'll announce the winner of the book to our online viewers at the end of the class. There are a few other myths that you may have heard about Washington that may or may not be true, so let me start off with those. One myth is he visited Betsy Ross and asked her to create the first flag. That is a myth. That didn't happen. Another one was he had wooden teeth, right? They weren't really wooden. They were made of composites from different animals. One myth was, we'll talk about Valley Forge a little bit, was that he knelt in prayer and prayed to God that the Union Army would be successful in the war, and that didn't really ever happen. And another myth is that he was a president who lived in the White House, and he's really the only president that never did live in the White House. So those are some myths. What I'm going to try to do tonight is to tell you a little bit about this great president and really try to bring him to life for you tonight. And hopefully my clicker will work here. I don't know. Okay, here we go. All right, so Millie said that I got really interested in this topic 5 years ago when I was in Cleveland. I was at an event, and a man came up to me at the end of the event and said, "Here's a book. I want you to take this book. I want you to have it, because this book is so important to the history of our country and how our country was founded." And I went home. You'll see it's kind of tattered. I guess I've probably read it 3 times, and it's an incredible story that will be part of what we talk about tonight. I read so much information about Washington, and a lot of it also came from this book on George Washington from Joseph Ellis called His Excellency, which was another nickname for Washington. So how many of you have ever been fortunate or unfortunate enough to come to one of my classes before? So most of you know I always have a thesis, right? I always have something that is what I'm going to talk about, what I want you to leave with tonight. And tonight I'm not going to have a thesis, but what I've got is 3 questions for you. The first question is the heavy one. This is the question at the end of tonight. If you're still with me, I'm going to ask you yes or no on the question: did God's sovereignty, and that word means did God's absolute power, select George Washington and prepare him for the task of helping birth and establish our great country? That's the first question I'm going to ask you. Was God involved in the formation of our country? The second question I'm going to ask you is, how close did the United States come to not being a republic, but being a monarchy? How close were we to having King George? And finally, the question I want to ask you is, what were some of Washington's leadership traits? He was a real lion. And what were some of the leadership traits that made him successful so much in his Revolutionary War days and in his time as president? I need a scribe tonight to help me up on the board tonight. And it's really simple. Who would help me write a few things down tonight? Okay, will you help me? Okay, great. Yeah, we're not quite ready yet, but I'll holler at you when we're ready to go. So, what were Washington's leadership traits? So let's start off with Washington, his young life. Born in 1732, his father, the patriarch, his grandfather, John Washington, came from England. He had, Washington loved to have real estate, own land. He probably got that from his grandfather because his father wasn't with him for long. His father died when Washington was only 11 years old. And in Washington's correspondence, which there was a lot of, he only mentions his father just 3 times. His father wasn't a big impact on his life. His mother, however, was an impact on his life, and she lived to see him become president. She never extolled or bragged about his triumphs. And unfortunately, they became estranged in later years. So Washington's father dies 1743, leaves 10,000 acres and 49 slaves. How would you like your father to leave you 10,000 acres? Washington receives a grade school education but never went to college. This will be him not going to college is a constant self-consciousness in his mind. He was always kind of nervous about it. So a major influence on him since his father died was his brother Lawrence. And Lawrence said, George, I want you to enlist in the British Navy. He had his bags packed and his mother stopped him and said, you're not going in the Navy, George. So Washington travels abroad with his brother and contracts smallpox, which was the disease of that time. And you'll find out that 100,000 people during the Revolutionary War died of smallpox. It was terrible. Washington contracts smallpox. He gets a mild case. His face got pocketed, almost like when your child got the chicken pox, maybe. And it was the way they could tell who had had smallpox and who didn't by their face. But his brother, who was such an influence on him, died in 1752, leaving him Mount Vernon, or at least the beginning parts of it. Early years, 6'2", average, a head taller than the average male, large hands, grayish blue eyes, hazel brown hair, strong, and I guess the woman just swooned over George. What do you think, ladies? But as his brother was dying, he went to the governor of Virginia. He was from Virginia, and he said, "I'd like a post in the militia." And based on this gentleman, a businessman, William Fairfax, he recommended Washington to the governor of Virginia. And it just so happened that George was romantically interested in his daughter, Sally. And Dinwiddie sends Washington to the Western Wilderness. So a little background, a little history background, French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was the final struggle between France and England for supremacy in America. England and France had been fighting for 75 years. English settlements had primarily the East Coast there was settled by the English. The middle part of the area down to kind of from Canada to the Mississippi Territory was really occupied by the French. Washington is involved in an early skirmish when he's in the militia. He says to his brother, I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming about that sound. And his news made it to a Virginia newspaper, and all of a sudden Washington was a favorite with people in Virginia. But before the English could go to war with the French over territory, I guess it was diplomatic protocol. The governor had to file a diplomatic objection, and it had to be done in person. So the governor in Virginia sends, he's worked with Washington. He says, young man, Washington's, get this, 21 years old. He's only 21. He says, I need you to go to northwestern Pennsylvania, deliver this letter for me to the French person there, and tell him we're gonna have to fight him. It's a 300-mile trip. It takes 6 weeks for Washington to get there. 21 years old, 300 miles, 6 weeks. He's accompanied by an interpreter and a guide. And where they're going is this place called Fort Duquesne. And it's where the Ohio River connects with the Monongahela River and the Allegheny River. It's a place called the Fort. It's right there. So Washington leaves. He goes there. He gets a hold of the French person and says, I've got this letter to hand you from the Virginia governor. The guy tells him, I'm not even going to read your stupid letter. You can just go back from where you came. But what Washington does is he memorizes all the weapons, all the boats, all the canoes, every different type of area on the three rivers, so that he can go back to the Virginia governor and tell him, the best way to approach attacking him. So based on Washington's trip, Washington is sent out to try to recapture the site after he returns home. And Washington learns the French soldiers are tracking him. So what he does is he creates a little fort about 40 miles away from Pittsburgh, and he sets out to dislodge the enemy. Now, who could imagine a 21-year-old building a fort? Okay, what he did was really incredible. The only problem was at this time he had about 200 people with him, and the French had about 1,100 soldiers. It wasn't really a close battle at all. So, what he called this fort that he built, he called it Fort Necessity. And 1,100 troops descend on Washington, and by dark, a third of Washington's troops are killed. He is hardly able to fight back, but right from the start, Washington had all these people in his corner backing him up. So in Williamsburg, Virginia, his mentor hears that Washington just got drubbed. He lost a third to a half of his men, and he creates a narrative that he wanted to try to make Washington look good. And regardless of the story, Washington was just incredibly creative to build this fort and report all the details about this fort to the governor. So I'm going to ask Candy to come on up and write down for us. She's going to keep track of the leadership traits, and number one will be creative. So you're just going to go, we'll leave room for about 10. Number one will be creative. He was very creative how he did that. That was a trait he had. So at this time, 1754, the French and British were ready to go at each other and create and go to war against each other. King George orders Edmund Braddock, one of Britain's best generals, to proceed to America. Braddock is 60 years old, but really he's their best general. Washington is excited to hear about Braddock coming over, so he sends Braddock a letter and he says, listen, could I be on your force that's going to go fight? I'd like to be a key member of the team. He's eager to study military tactics. Ever since he was fired at the first time, he loves the idea of being involved in the militia. His mother, Mary, tries to persuade him not to accept the Braddock invitation, but Washington departs to meet General Braddock. Big problem. The Americans, since they were just a group of states, they didn't have any way to raise money. They had no horses, they had no equipment, they had no wagons. They didn't have what they needed to fight. So who comes to the rescue? Anybody know who came to the rescue of Braddock and Washington to get this force underway? Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin saved the day. He talked to farmers in Pennsylvania. He lined up horses, wagons. They needed 1,500 horses. And Franklin says to all these Pennsylvania farmers, if you lend us your supplies, the king will make it good for anything you lose. And so Franklin was able to collect 150 wagons, 250 horses, but a lot of the farmers were hesitant to give their prized possessions to Franklin, even though everybody, he was he had an incredible reputation. So Franklin was forced to give personal guarantees on all these horses, on all this equipment, which if I don't give you your equipment back, then I'm on the hook for this myself. This allowed the force to be created. Now, Franklin, while he's meeting with Washington about getting this equipment together, he says, Washington, listen, you need to tell Braddock these Indians are savage. Whatever you do, don't just run into them. What you've got to do is you've got to send little troops of scouting parties out to avoid these dangerous savage Indians that will do anything if they come across you. And at this point in time, a really interesting name comes up, Daniel Boone. Braddock didn't want to go to Fort Duquesne the way Washington knew to get there, and he didn't follow Washington's advice. So they had to cut through woods all the way from Virginia up to the fort, and Daniel Boone helped clear that path for them. When Washington meets with Braddock, he's so detail-oriented. He hands Braddock a list of notes on every single thing he knows about the fort, all the troops, how they should configure them, how they should march. So the next day, the Indians who were in the area actually offered to Braddock, we would like to come and help you fight the French. But Braddock he's a gruff 60-year-old guy who thinks he knows how to do everything, and he's rude to them, and they turn away, and actually they go join the other side. which was a terrible outcome. It was a terrible, terrible decision. And that led to the Battle of the Monongahela, which is what we're going to talk about right here. July 9th, 1755, Braddock's British crossed the river. Noon, Washington, he's excited. He's part of the military. He's with the most famous general in the world. He looks at the British regiments. They're all in their red suits. They look wonderful. They've got their hats. They're in equal columns. They're just all spread out. They're ready to do the right thing and go to war. Well, what they didn't know is that that the French could easily see them in their red suits, and the French came in, snuck in, and totally surprised Braddock. Totally surprised Washington. There were 72 French, 146 Canadians, and 637 Indians. It would have been nice to be nice to those Indians, right? And they were there to take on 1,300 English. The French knew the territory, and they ambushed them. At 1 o'clock, there was an eruption of musket balls flying everywhere. The ground was littered with death and dying, humans and horses. It smelled bad. People were trampled by wagons that Franklin had brought to the mix. It was a terrible thing. The British were in utter just confusion. They couldn't believe that, as good as they looked in these uniforms, that somebody could just come up and totally surprise them. And the French had just been concealed, just ready for the opportunity to turn on them. Braddock, the guy was an incredible general. He was showered with bullets. It's said that he had 5 horses shot out from under him. Can you imagine? 5 horses? Nearly every member of the staff, Washington, Braddock, almost everyone except Washington was shot down. Washington and Braddock were the only uninjured ones. It was Indian-style fighting, savage fighting, pandemonium. There were scalps being taken. And it was during this 2-hour period of time that many believe was compelling evidence that God's care and direct intervention happened on Washington's behalf. This is a picture of what it might have looked like, how courageous Braddock was, what it looked like when 5 horses were shot out from under him. But Washington, the day of the attack, had been sick, but he was unflinching in the face of disaster. One witness said, "I expected him to fall." Indians confirmed they singled out Washington and shot at him without effect. The Indians became convinced that Washington was protected by an invisible power. Hundreds of victims fell around him. Braddock is finally shot. Braddock dies. What's Washington have to do? He's sick. He has to take over. He has to take over the men that are left. At this time, he's 23. Braddock is unable to, before he died, he was unable to mount a horse, and he perished. This is a famous painting depicting the burial of General Edward Braddock, who was a great war hero. When Washington was able to get away with the 30 people that were left, he was able to take Braddock and back to the fort that he built right by Fort Duquesne, and that's where they were able to bury Braddock at Fort Necessity. When Washington was able to get away, he went to Cumberland in Maryland, 217 miles away. At that point in time, if you rode a horse, you might get 10 miles. You might be able to make about 10 miles in a day. Not a lot. And this is what he tells his brother. He says, "But by the miraculous care of Providence," which means the protective care of God, "I have been protected beyond all human probability of expectation. I had 4 bullets through my coat, 2 horses who fell under me. I escaped unhurt, although death was leveling to my companions on every side." From the letter, Washington he'd started to believe that he had God's protection on his side. And note, this defeat of Braddock came to great hardship on Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin had guaranteed all the equipment. Almost all the equipment was gone, and all the owners of the farms in Pennsylvania came back to Ben Franklin and went after the 20,000 pounds of goods that they left, which was about $4 billion, and just about ruined Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was 49 years old at that time. I think Franklin lived to be 84, maybe. He still had a few good years left to do some great things, but that's a tough story about him. After the battle, several facts surface about what had happened. One Indian warrior testified, "I had 17 fair fires at Washington with my rifle and not one of them touched him." French trappers told a story of a Red Hawk Indian chief that was involved in the wind. He talked of shooting Washington 11 times without hitting him. Red Hawk insisted his gun had never missed its mark before. Everyone was talking about Washington. In 1755, Reverend Samuel Davis, the greatest preacher in America at that time, said, "I cannot but hope Providence that God has preserved a manner for Colonel Washington to have some important service in this country." 20 years later, it was apparent that he had. Braddock's personal physician, trying to reach Braddock at the burial, ran across an Indian chief. Here's the chief's story. "It was on that day the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest. I noticed Washington and told our people, 'Quick, let your aim be certain,' and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, but for us we missed. 'Twas all in the vein as a power mightier far than we shielded him. The great spirits protect that man." Later, the old chief would meet with Washington. The old chief said to Washington, he looked him in the eyes and said, "I've come to pay homage to the man who is in particular favorite of heaven and the man who cannot die." So after Braddock dies, Washington goes back to Virginia. He's 23. His reputation is everywhere. Everyone has talked about him. In the next 3 years, he recruits an elite unit of 1,000 men. He keeps detailed records of everything about the men. The men who are drunk or lewd, they get up to 1,000 lashes. He was a real disciplinarian. His goal was to make the regiment a truly special unit. During this time, he drafts literally thousands of orders to the troops. This is what the uniform looked like. In 1758, Washington joins what became known as the Forbes Exhibition to take Fort Duquesne for the third time. They get to the fort, find it's deserted, and that the French had run. They knew they'd be outnumbered. During Washington's work with General Forbes, it shows he's 26 years old at this time. He's headstrong. He's overeager. He goes around Forbes, who was a well-respected general, and questions him and gives orders to the troops that were outside of his line of command. Washington is so concerned about a surprise ambush after being taken before with that ambush that he orders all the dogs in the regiment to be killed. But he starts to show himself to the nation. He showed his courage with Forbes. He emerged from scary experiences when he was young. He had such a sense of ambition. He was brave at Fort Necessity, taking over after Braddock died. So trait number 2 develops. Thank you to our scribe. No, you're perfect. That's great. This is a brave guy. This is a brave guy. This is a guy who is willing to take on just about anything. We saw what happened at Fort Necessity, taking over Braddock after his death. And along this way, something else happens. Washington meets his wife-to-be that Millie talked about. Her name is Martha Dandridge Curtis. Wealthiest widow in Virginia. She has 18,000 acres. She is a prize catch. She's got a huge dowry. Washington proposes to her in 1758. In 1758, he is elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, which would be like the State House. And he and Martha wed in 1759. Nothing has a greater influence on him. The marriage decision kind of escalates Washington into the top echelon of plantation owners in Virginia. And for the next 16 years, he really just perfects kind of an elegant lifestyle of living on and at Mount Vernon, of really being a Virginia aristocrat. So Mount Vernon, has anybody been there? about 1 million people visit it a year. And it's on the banks of the Potomac. Washington, during this time when he met Martha, was able to enlarge it to 6,500 acres. At this time, he had 46 slaves, which we'll talk about. Rumors persisted that he was still interested in Sally Fairfax. It's hard to say because when Washington died, all his detailed writings, there were so many, Martha destroyed them all. So it's kind of hard to piece some things together about Washington's life. But in running Mount Vernon, he did everything. Got up, rode 2 to 5 hours a day, fox hunting. He's meticulously groomed, orders everything from a London tailor, and he serves on several committees at the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. And in running the plantation, it's obvious about one thing. We'll talk about trait number 3. He is detail-oriented. This is a guy that likes to write things down and issue orders and make sure that he's got all his kind of ducks in a row. That's Mount Vernon if you've been there. Over 1 million people go there a year. So a couple things about Washington. He and Martha had no children, but Martha had 2 kids. Jackie was one. And Washington, his entire life, was hopeful that Jackie would get a college education since he never had one. Patsy, unfortunately, had epileptic seizures and wasn't well. She died at the age of 17. But Washington took them in his own. In the 1750s, slavery, Washington, in the early 1750s, he had no moral anxiety about owning other human beings. It was kind of a norm for plantation owners. It was how it was. He thought of them as kind of a species of property, which I know sounds terrible. And when they ran away, he posted descriptions about them to try to get them back. The one thing he did do, he said, I will not break up any slave families. And later in his life, his thoughts on slavery would change. His business interests, he sold tobacco. He shipped tobacco overseas for his acreages, and he spent lavishly on Mount Vernon. So bad luck struck him. They had a bad tobacco crop one year, and his person overseas in England told him, hey, you're overdrawn on your bank account. And this was a problem Washington had. He was a spender. He spent a lot on Mount Vernon especially, and cheap Spanish tobacco was driving down the prices. And what happened was a series of acts that you've heard about, British acts, started to impact Washington's business and really started to bring him to the front of being the leader that he was. The first thing that happens, the Stamp Act passes. For those of you who might have taken my class on Sam Adams, we talked a lot about the Stamp Act. It was really the first thing that just started to drive the people in Massachusetts crazy. The Stamp Act goes into effect. This is the first time Parliament tries to impose a direct tax. Washington is against the tax, saying the Stamp Act presents a clear and unequivocal denial of Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. Washington, along the way, gives up tobacco, turns the Mount Vernon into a wheat farm and also a full spinning operation. And also during this time, he loves to travel. Everybody talked about the Ohio country as the next frontier that everyone would go to. Washington ended up owning many, many acres of land in Ohio. The only problem was the British thought they owned Ohio, and the French thought they owned Ohio. So if Washington thought he owned acreage, did he really own it? A couple years later, the Townshend Act passes, where the British impose duties on colonial imports, create new taxes. Washington writes a letter to his neighbor. You're going to start hearing about all the famous people that he knew. Can you imagine my neighbor is George Mason? He writes a letter to his neighbor, George Mason, who was a founding father and really author of kind of the Virginia Declaration of Independence. He says it seems highly necessary that something should be done to avert the tax and maintain the liberty which he had derived from our ancestors. Really, Washington was mild. He felt like he was self-conscious about his education. He was scared to speak out, that he might say the wrong thing. George Mason really had a huge influence on Washington's willingness to really become a nationwide figure. Washington visits the House of Burgesses and has this proposal to not allow any British goods to come in. And it's at this point of his career that he became an acknowledged leader of the resistance movement. At this point in time, Washington's 30 years old. That's at this point in time, this is 8 years away from the Declaration of Independence. Parliament, seeing a revolt starting to happen in the United States, backpedals, takes the Stamp Act and Townsend Act off the table, and gives the United States people about a 5-year window where there really wasn't much going on. Washington wasn't really a student of history, but he says, hey, the measures which the British administration have for some time been and now are violently pursuing are repugnant to every principle of natural justice. In 1774 in Boston, the Intolerable Acts passed. This was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, because what happened with the Intolerable Acts, the British closed Boston's port. And Boston was the main area where stuff came in, at least in the north. And the people in Boston went crazy. Washington said about this, the cause of Boston will be considered as ever the cause of America. Martial laws imposed in Massachusetts. This is when Sam Adams, John Hancock, they had to go into hiding because they were worried they were going to be captured and killed. George Mason's influence on Washington is strong, and it really helps to clarify Washington's view of America. The Continental Congress happens in 1774. 7 delegates are chosen. Washington is voted third behind Richard Henry Lee and in front of somebody's name you probably know, Patrick Henry, right? Richard Henry Lee was a great orator who said a political crisis in the colonies of enormous magnitude is in the air. Militia units start to organize in Virginia as they see what's happening up in Boston. This is the time when Patrick Henry gave his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." So why did Washington conclude that war was going to happen? When the British troops came to Boston in 1774, King George sought to make Massachusetts a lesson. The final straw was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Has anybody ever heard of that? Now, does anybody know what happened the day before the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened? The day before that battle started was the day of Paul Revere's ride. So Revere had taken his ride to notify everybody that the British were coming. But what he really had to do, he had to get to where Sam Adams and Paul Revere were hiding, which was a little bit past Lexington. And Revere arrived, I can't remember if it was midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, and he had to sneak them out of there and keep them away, or they probably would have both died. So it was an important time. But Lexington and Concord was like the beginning of the battle when that started. So who chose Washington to lead the army? John Adams claims that, our second president. It was a foregone conclusion. Virginia was the most wealthy state, or the most wealthy colony of any of the colonies. It's where everybody really, a lot of the people who thought they mattered. That's where all the aristocrats were. And Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician, said, Washington has so much martial dignity in this department that you would distinguish him to be a general and soldier from among 10,000 people, just by the way he carried himself. It was during the Continental Congress that Washington, he's the only delegate there to wear his uniform. When he approaches Philadelphia in his custom-built chariot, there are 500 people escorting him. This is like Sam Adams traveling from, I don't know if you remember the story, Sam Adams traveling from Boston to Philadelphia. The streets are lined with people. It was said there were 800 to 1,000 people lining the streets from Boston to Philadelphia to cheer these people on going to Philadelphia. And I guess the question could be, who other than Washington could be the unifying symbol of the 13 colonies? This is what it might have looked like on the ride. It was it was really something else. So despite telling people he did not want the position, he continually told everyone, including his wife, sorry, I've got to do this. I don't want to do it. He was chosen leader of the army. He's 43 years old. He leaves Mount Vernon. He won't return for 10 years. He's not a military genius. As a matter of fact, he'd lost more battles than he'd won. But he's able to learn from his heirs. He's smart. He's brave. He's creative. And the guy worked all the time. He worked all hours of the night, and he was starting to believe he could not be killed. At this point in time, he was running into problems financially. He had so much debt. He had to take, when Patsy died, he had to take her inheritance to pay off his debt because Mount Vernon was in terrible shape. But trait 4 emerges about Washington, and that is that he is a very hard worker, or if I can say the word, indefatigable. Is that right? He's a hard worker, always working all the time. The Battle of Bunker Hill happens June 1775. 2,200 British troops make 3 assaults on the New England militia. I don't know if I've got a pointer here or not. Let's see here if I do. Oh, I guess I do. Oh no. Oh no. Okay, so I'll just have to kind of point, but the British win but lose 1,000 casualties, and Washington insists to all that will listen, we can only win with an army of regular trained soldiers. He's got a bunch of misfits in his army. I mean, these are people that just come off the farms, that have never been in the army or anything like it. Washington tells John Adams, listen, talk to the British, let's get out of this if we can. But Bunker Hill, as you can see, is just by Boston, right? Part of Boston, Breeds Hill, Cambridge on the other side of the water there. Washington starts to communicate to the public about the need for independence. One of the real interesting things about the time of the Revolution, is when people were actually willing to start to talk about it. It was a really taboo topic. Who's going to be the first to say we need to be independent? Washington and Adams conclude that King George III is determined to pursue them militarily. In the siege of Boston, Washington is able to hold 10,000 British troops bottled up in the city for 9 months. Thomas Paine at this time releases his book, Common Sense. The book has a huge following. There's only 4 million people in the United States at this time. Can you imagine 120,000 copies of a book being sold in 1775? How popular that must have been. Everybody had one. And in the book, Paine says, King George III is no friend to American liberty. Tensions rise to a really point where the water's boiling. And it's at this time, for the first time, the people in New York and Massachusetts write Washington letters, and they start to refer to him as Your Excellency, a title that people referred to him forever. At one point, when Washington was on the battlefield, somebody tried to deliver a letter to Washington's personal secretary. It said George Washington. And the personal secretary said, I'm sorry, unless you put on the letter His Excellency, I will not deliver the letter to him. Question. What did the colonies expect? Did they expect that Washington would be the next king? Did they really have any kind of an idea what other leadership structure there could possibly be for them? British General Gage, who was pivotal in the Sam Adams debate, he was in Boston. He basically says, Washington, what are you doing with this high profile? And he says, Washington says, I cannot conceive of any more honorable title than that which flows from the uncorruptible choice of the brave and free people. The British would change, this is an interesting fact, during the Revolutionary War, the British changed leaders 4 times. We changed leaders. We did not change leaders once. Washington tells his troops, this is a noble cause we are engaged in. Freedom or slavery will be the result of your conduct. And at this point in time, Martha joins George and is with him most of the rest of the time during the Revolution. This is Washington's team of lieutenants. He says something really interesting here. This is so typical of his of his approach to management. It is absolutely necessary for me to have people that can think for me. He was a delegator. He was a hard worker. He was a great manager. This is his team. Joseph Reed. He's a lawyer, military officer. Alexander Hamilton, his most trusted advisor, who would be with him the entire time. People hated Hamilton. Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. We'll talk about that. He founded the Federalist Party. Charles Lee was known as Boiling Water Lee. He was a tough general, fiery temperament. Horatio Gates was referred to as Granny Gates because he was a whopping 50 years old. Great general. So trait number 5, Washington. He's a good manager. Could we give our scribe here a round of applause to thank her for her competent help? Thank you. But he's got a great team to start off the war with. Washington, he goes to John Hancock, the first president of Congress, and says, I need troops. 20,372 men is what he requests. And this is the flag that Washington designs called the Union flag. Kind of looks like the British flag, doesn't it? Washington, when he finds out recruiting is below expected expectations, Washington does the unexpected. What does Washington do? He enlists Negroes into to be integrated into his army. And this is the first time. This is not done again until the Korean War. This is a man who's far ahead of his time. Now, he needed people, let's be honest, but I think it was great thinking. So he had an integrated continental army. It didn't happen again until the Korean War. His smallpox strategy. If you got a pockmarked face, you could go into Boston and fight. Many Americans opposed the inoculation. They had an inoculation which became mandatory 2 years after the start of the war, but it wasn't mandatory at the start. And for all you COVID-19 fans out there, many believe Washington's swift response to smallpox, the epidemic, was the most important strategic decision of his military career. We'll talk about that when it happened. Over 2/3 of the American casualties were the result of the disease. Far more people died from smallpox than in the war. 10 to 30 funerals a day would take place. At any point in time, 1/4 to 1/5 of Washington's army would be on the sidelines suffering from smallpox. It was terrible. Fortunately, Washington was immune because he had had it when he visited overseas with his brother. 33,000 sailors leave Great Britain to sail to America. King George says, enough, we're going to crush this rebellion. We're going to go after all those rabble-rousers in Boston, Massachusetts, all the way down to Virginia. What Britain was concerned about, they could have granted us a pass, the U.S. a pass. But Britain was concerned about the domino theory, which would mean that if they granted us a pass, then what would happen when it happened in Canada? What would happen when it happened in Ireland? What would happen to all their properties in the British Caribbean? This domino theory becomes the core reason for Britain to go full steam ahead. The Brits enjoyed full naval superiority. They had boats. They could go to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston. America had almost no boats. That didn't really turn around until the War of 1812, when that was one of the strengths of the Americans, but they had no boats. But the discipline and combat experience of British regulars gave the Brits just a really big advantage in this war. So Washington has 3 choices in terms of running this war. The first choice is he can take a hit and run guerrilla tactics, go over the Alleghenies and go in full engagement. Number 2, he could fight a war of posts, which was basically a series of defensive tactical engagements. Washington knew the territory, the Brits really didn't. Or confront the British directly with his entire force. The first option, the hit and run tactics, Washington never considered. He thought he'd only do that as a last resort. The second, fighting a defensive war, was, he believed, dishonorable. I'm not going to sit here and just take a defensive position and let these guys attack us. So what did Washington do? He was I should probably put a negative list of traits over here too. He was, we won't write it down. He was a gambler. Okay. So Washington, his generals give him these list of 3 options here. Washington says, well, I'm going to take all my 15,000 troops, and you know what? I'm going to go for one big battle. And at the time of these 33,000 people coming over, the British are being led by 2 prominent figures, General William Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. These guys were strategic. One of the problems that the Union soldiers had was that, especially in New York, the New York people were loyal to the British. And so Washington was concerned about all these people he heard were coming over. What happens? Are these people in New York all of a sudden, when the British come, are they going to actually help? Are they actually going to help the British? So on July 3rd, 1776, July 3rd, one day before the Declaration, Lowe's fleet of 30 warships and 400 vessels pour into Staten Island, right outside New York. This buildup is the largest military force ever assembled in North America. This is what it looked like on July 4th. The Declaration was signed. So, audience question at this point in time, Millie, you can't answer. Who wrote the majority of the Declaration of Independence? Louder? Thomas Jefferson. Who was the first signer? John Hancock. Did George Washington sign the Declaration? No, he didn't sign the Declaration. He was serving as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in New York, where 33,000 sailors were coming. So the signing of the Declaration is taking place while 33,000 people are about ready to land in New York. These guys kind of look calm in this picture. My guess is they probably weren't. Washington says, I'm going to throw all my chips into New York. He asks John Adams to form a board of war. Washington says to the troops, remember, you are free men fighting for the blessings of liberty, and that slavery will be your portion and that of posterity if you do not acquit yourself like men. If you don't fight like men. The Battle of Long Island. It's the 33,000 arrive. Washington's thrown his 15,000 in. Oh, it's just a humiliating defeat. Our generals are outgeneraled. Washington's own inexperience. He has never had 15,000 men at his command before, even though he's a good, hardworking manager. And right away, Washington's generals say, they vote 10-3 and say, we need to start to fight a defensive war where we know where we're at and they don't know where they're at. And you know what? Washington listens to them. And when the colonists in New York who were loyal to the British see the drubbing that Washington took, many of the New Yorkers start to sign up for the British. Washington says to his generals, I'm concerned the game is pretty near up. But Admiral Howe makes a misstep in New York and allows Washington to evacuate, to get away. And there was really only one bright spot about New York, and that was a group called the Maryland 400. Anybody heard of the Maryland 400? A group from Baltimore called the Maryland 400 had brand new equipment, weapons, and bayonets. They were practiced, and they came and got in the middle of Washington trying to retreat and was able to allow Washington and the rest of its troops to escape to fight another day. It was a tremendous thing they did. Fighting in winter at the time, it was the belief that armies should not fight during the winter. Washington understands that independence is on the verge of extinction. He decides to have a surprise attack on Christmas night. He crosses the Delaware. This is the famous picture that you've seen of Washington crossing the Delaware. I hate to spoil the surprise to tell you Washington probably wasn't really standing. As he would have gone headlong into the ice. But one thing is sure true, Washington personally led the assault, and once again, his bravery came forward. His 2,400 troops descend on the Brits. This is where Washington crossed the Delaware. From eastern Pennsylvania, he crossed the Delaware. He went down to Trenton first, and he attacks Trenton, figuring that Americans are desperate for a win. We've got to get a win He escapes with his 6,000 men. It wasn't a big win, but it was a small win, and a win was a win. Washington says, we've got to have a permanent army. The Continental Congress grants Washington dictatorial power, sensing that the situation is desperate. The war is that close to being lost. Washington's army is down to 3,000 men in 1777. Hancock's offering bounties. Troops are stricken with smallpox. Washington loses the city of Philadelphia to Admiral Lowe. The British, with their strong navy, can go anywhere they want. You can see the British, I don't have my pointer, but they leave New York. And they take their boats just down the East Coast, past the Delaware Bay, down to the Chesapeake Bay, up through the Chesapeake Bay, right up to Philadelphia, and just are very easily able to take the city of Philadelphia. Next, the Battle of Brandy Creek happened. It was 25 miles southwest of Philadelphia. The casualties in Britain totaled 600. American casualties are twice that. A second battle happens in Germantown, which is right by Philadelphia also. Washington's troops try to hold himself up in a dwelling, and 75 of them are bayoneted by the British and killed. But the story of Brandywine, an interesting story that goes back to this, is British Army officer Patrick Ferguson. He encounters Washington, and in surprise, he claims that shooting Washington all but once disgusted him. He couldn't shoot his gun. He couldn't shoot at Washington. Ferguson locks his eyes on Washington, and he said, I could have lodged half a dozen bullets into him. Ferguson had a singular impulse to shoot Washington, but his hand was stopped. Was this another example of providence in the operation that stopped Ferguson from shooting Washington? Saratoga comes next, one of the biggest wins of the battle. Washington sends one of his top generals, Benedict Arnold, to Saratoga near Albany. The British general surrenders 6,000 men. Tremors are felt in the Continental Congress. They hear about the win at Saratoga. Everyone in the street is roaring. Congratulations, Washington, go Washington. Horatio Gates, who's the general, he's the whopping 50-year-old one, kind of ruffles Washington's feathers, claiming, hey, this success was me. I was the general that won Saratoga. Washington says to Gates, Saratoga is a splendid victory, but we must not encourage anyone, including you yourself, to forget who is the commander-in-chief. People start to talk about Washington's ego. Is a strong ego good or bad? It gets out that criticism of Washington could only take the form of whispers. Criticism is muted. Questions in the Continental Congress, how could such a brilliant general lose so many battles? Gates learns to shut up. John Adams reflects on Washington's ego. He says, now, we can allow a certain citizen to be wise, virtuous, and good without thinking him a deity or savior. Washington hears about the criticism. He says, whenever the public gets tired of me or a person is found better qualified than I will be glad to retire and learn and return to private life. Washington tells his army, prepare for winter. A third of his army doesn't have shoes. Survival of the army becomes his highest priority. General Nathaniel Greene, who was a trusted advisor, warns Washington that the message from Brandywine is that the Continental Army was no match for Howe's regular army. Greene's message, you've got to wait for more skilled troops before we attack. Washington listens. And around that time, something super important to this whole story happens. Valley Forge. The date is December 17th. This is a map of Valley Forge. Washington orders the end of the campaign for winter, moves into Valley Forge. Washington tells his troops, I will share in the hardship and be part of every convenience with you. He talks about Valley Forge. He says, to see men without clothes, to cover their nakedness, without a blanket to lay on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet, is a mark of patience and obedience, which is my opinion, can scarcely be paralleled. Most of the horses died from starvation or exposure. Their carcasses smelled. The ranks of the Continental Army were now filled with weak, indentured servants, landless sons, and recent immigrants. Men were between 15 and 25 years old. Time appears to be on the British side. Washington comments to Henry Lawrence, the president of the Congress, unless we solve personnel and money problems, one of three things is going to happen. We're going to starve, dissolve, or disperse. British has taxing powers. We don't have taxing powers here yet. Washington's size is now 12,000. Howe evacuates Philadelphia, and Admiral Howe, the British general, he resigns. He told them, I failed to win the war. I've got to resign. He's replaced by Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Charles Cornwallis. British start to adopt a Southern strategy. Washington's conclusion, our army is now starting to become a match for the British. Key point. This is the one many of you don't know probably. This is the one I want you to remember. The key point of the war becomes the French alliance of 1778. A treaty is signed with the French where they agree to support the Americans' independence during the Revolutionary War. The alliance was crucial to the outcome of the war. The French had a large naval fleet that could counter the British boats. The French support started slow, and Washington was concerned. The French were way down in the Indies. West Indies took them a while to get up north. Washington had problems with the Indians too. The Indians were convinced we were going to lose, so they joined the side of the British. They fought against Washington. Washington had to send troops to retaliate against the Iroquois. Washington's troops destroyed 20 Indian towns and villages. Britain keeps coming. After Washington's triumph at Saratoga, many thought this was the beginning of the end. Washington needed resources. Washington says, where are my friends, George Mason and Thomas Jefferson? The country was just suffering from a failure of political leadership. 1780, Washington sends the states letters requesting money, supplies, and recruits. He asks for expanded powers. Washington says we can no longer drudge on in the old way. Congress must speak in a more decisive tone. They must do more than just recommend. They must dictate, or our cause is lost. The Southern campaign begins. Charleston, the city of Charleston, falls to the British. Horatio Gates is routed at Camden. This is a shocker. Washington sends his best general, Benedict Arnold, to West Point, which he regarded as crucial. As it turned out, Arnold had been negotiating a bribe with the British. Arnold turns on Washington. At the last minute, the plot's exposed. Washington captures Arnold's number 2 in command, hangs him like a spy. This is the famous story when Benedict Arnold turned traitor. You've heard the term before. He's a real Benedict Arnold. It was a shock. The troops almost revolt. 1,000 troops who had no winter clothes, who hadn't been paid, they revolt. This is what it looked like as 1,000 men stormed the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So what happened to change the direction of the war? This guy right here, Count Rochambeau. March 1st, 1781, after 5 years, the states ratify the Articles of Confederation, and the French army of 6,000 troops lands in Rhode Island. Rochambeau moves his troops to Rhode Island to link up with Washington. It turns out this is a critical point of the war. Rochambeau was a commander-in-chief in France, where he fought in Austria and Germany. He was originally said, I don't want to go to America because you're only going to give me 6,000 to 7,000 troops, which is how many he was given. Good news, bad news. Daniel Morgan, an influential soldier, had big wins in, this is South Carolina right here, in Cowpen, South Carolina. And then they went up to Guilford Courthouse in the middle of North Carolina, and they had a big win there. But Nathaniel Greene was hit in Guilford Courthouse, lost. And problems developed with Benedict Arnold. Washington is concerned if Benedict Arnold would deflect and be a traitor, do I have other people out there that are going to do the same thing? He starts to disagree with the French General Rochambeau. Washington is obsessed with this loss he took in New York, where he had the 15,000 people that he threw everything at it. He says to Rochambeau, I want to go back to New York. This will be the final battle of the war. This is where we need to go. Rochambeau says, I want to go to the Chesapeake to take on the British and at their southern campaign. Rochambeau, without talking to Washington, instructs his fleet to go to the Chesapeake. Washington, sensing that he might get a big win, takes his troops and heads to Yorktown. This is Yorktown right here. For those of you who know where Williamsburg, Virginia is, Yorktown is directly to the east of that on the York River, and you'll see the Chesapeake Bay right out to the right. This became just such an important battle. The French were all in. Of course, even though Rochambeau was really leading Yorktown, Washington enters a 55-point memo. Remember, he's detail-oriented, right? He issues a 55-page point memo to the troops of what they're supposed to do. And Washington's given the ceremonial honor of firing the first cannon against the British. Fighting goes on for 19 days. Cornwallis understands they're going to get beat. Rochambeau's troops are a great help. And Cornwallis prepares to surrender the British troops. Cornwallis pleads illness and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't feel well. I can't go to the surrender party. I'm sorry." I guess I can understand that, but the decisive battle of the war had just been won. Washington had really no understanding the war was over. He visits Philadelphia and says, "Please let me keep my troops intact. I don't trust this king at all." At the same time, it's interesting, Thomas Paine, you remember him from Common Sense, visits Washington, and he says, listen, the war started in 1775, it went to 1782. In British folklore, the number 7 is a really important number. So you can see you've been out for 7 years, so you really have won. The war is over. Sad news, his son Jackie, who had visited Washington, comes down with meningitis and dies right as Washington reaches his bedside. Whispers start to persist. A young officer in the army says, I don't like this continental form of government. He says it exposes what a weak republic you've got. He said, what we need is Washington to name himself a king. Washington needs to be the king. Our government's too weak. The only kind of government that will work is a king. Washington tells them at this point, he says, banish these thoughts from your mind. King George III comments on Washington being a possible monarch and says, if Washington resists the monarchical mantle and retires, as he said he would, he will be the greatest man in the world. Washington's preeminence at this time, I couldn't really explain it to you. No public figure had ever enjoyed such a status as Washington. Key lessons learned. Washington understands his place in history. And the thing I want you to walk away from tonight with is that Washington understands the core principle of republicanism. All legitimate power is derived from the consent of the governed. A phrase you've heard. And a key trait, number 6, emerges for my scribe to write down. And these are traits of the kind of leader Washington was. He was a lion, but a key trait arrives, and that's self-awareness. And it's kind of like having an internal mirror in yourself where you know what you're thinking. You understand the way you feel. You know how your behavior impacts others, and you can reflect on yourself and do the right thing. And when Washington made the statement about banish those thoughts from your mind, that was a sense of his self-awareness taking hold for the country. Washington isn't sure that revolution is over. So Washington, many of you know me, I'm not what you call a big government guy, okay? But Washington had to fight this war with nobody. He didn't have troops. He didn't have money. He scrounged for every move he made. His first instinct was, we've got to have at least a government that's big enough to at least let us do a great job. He also starts to fear his mortality. He's 50 years old. His personal secretary, John Lorenz, dies. His valuable subordinate, Nathaniel Greene, dies of sunstroke. Charles Lee, one of his best generals, dies. Was he dying? Was he getting old? Was he ready to die? His hair was gray, his eye sockets permanently creased. He begins a tour of the United States, and he starts in Detroit. And on the tour, Washington says to the citizens, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. Take advantage of this new freedom you've got. This is so interesting. 1782, there's a dinner for Washington to honor His Excellency. Would His Excellency become the next king? At this dance for Washington stuns the audience. He comes up to the podium where he's recognized and he says, I hereby retire from the great theater of action and take leave of the enjoyments of public life. This banquet's going on for him. They're eating. He gets up with his entourage. He leaves and walks out the door to his chariot and leaves. Washington on God. He was never a religious man. This is a bust of him that he did agree to be commissioned, which you've probably seen, a famous bust sculpture of George Washington. What Washington did during the interim was he went to the West, which was where he thought the future of America was, to Ohio. What Washington wanted to do, I don't have my map of the United States, he wanted to do what was called progressive seating, where the states would start to take states from east to west. The big problem was Great Britain was over there. And Washington owned 60,000 acres, and he wasn't sure if they were his, but they were the main source of his income now. Mount Vernon wasn't. Washington receives a letter from Robert Pleasance, a Quaker. He says, there are so many advocates for the noble cause during the war, but he says, are these truths that Jefferson had enshrined in the Declaration that all men are created equal? How does this apply to you, you plantation owner? How sad it would be if you're such a great American hero if you failed the final test of holding a number of people to absolute slavery. Washington couldn't dismiss this letter. It really impacted him. Washington got it with his personal secretary, and he said, this might be the time when we consider some kind of emancipation. It could have been that Washington was the one, not 80 years later, Lincoln. He writes Robert Morris, a financier. He says, I can only say that a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolishment of slavery. Washington owned 300 slaves, but only 100 of them worked. And he was always worried about finances because he had run out of money. He had to use his stepdaughter's inheritance to pay his bills. And many of the 300 slaves he owned were women who were bearing children. The children couldn't work. The women were not really able to work all the time. There were older slaves that weren't able to work. So of the 300 slaves, about 100 of them could work. And it was kind of an economic decision for Washington. But Washington at this time tells his manager, I'm going to abandon slave labor. The question is, would he do that? He hadn't before. 3 years after the war end, John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court judge, says, we're going to have a constitutional convention. He tells Washington, you cannot view these revisions as an unconcerned spectator. Washington tells Jay, it's not my business to embark again on this sea of troubles. He wants to just go back to Mount Vernon and ride his horse 6 hours a day. Washington, at Jay's insistence, agrees to chair the convention. Shays' Rebellion happens in 1786. 15,000 men join a rebellion at Bunker Hill. Washington says, it's hard to be imagined that this great body of people can be employed in darkness and not understand what has just happened to this country. He says, they can't see the rays of distant sun through all the mist of intoxication and folly. Washington gets cold feet. He says, why? He says to Henry Knox, who next to Alexander Hamilton is probably his best confidant, he says, how could I risk reputation in a venture that might not succeed? I promised to leave public life in 1783. The current government is like a house on fire. Knox says to Washington's ego, he appeals to his friend. He says, but what happens if the outcome secures your legacy? Knox goes on to tell Washington, this could entitle you to be called the father of your country. Here his friend Knox is appealing to his ego. Washington decides to support Madison and start to talk about the details of the Constitution. Washington says to Madison, the articles must be replaced, not revised. Washington favors stronger government. Jay and Madison offer to train Washington on the details of government theory. Washington says, I don't really understand some of these things you're talking about. Jay and Madison said there have to be three branches of government. There has to be an executive. There has to be a legislative. There has to be judicial branches. The question of sovereignty comes up. Madison says we've got to consider the states. Madison wants a federal veto over the states. It's during these meetings with Jay and Madison, who at this time Washington was very close to, that Washington forms his view on government. This is when the government was born. This is when federalism was born during these meetings, that these guys were training Washington to understand, to lead. The Constitutional Convention happens in spring 1787. It's strong debate. One of the interesting things that happens is Washington says about the Constitution, there's too many ambiguous things in there. Have any of you ever said that to yourself? The Constitution's too ambiguous? And Madison says, that's what makes it strong. And over the years, Madison was probably proven to be right on that. Madison and Hamilton work on the Federalist Papers. Washington is intrigued by these Federalist Papers. He plays no public role in the ratification. He just stands there. Patrick Henry, George Mason are opposed. Washington is confident the Constitution could be ratified, and it is ratified, June 21st, 1788. Washington continues to be uncertain about this role of presidency that's created in the Constitution. Hamilton sends Washington a bracing rebuke and says that Washington has to be part of the government. Washington tells his friend, my movement to the chair of government president will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to a place of execution. But in his heart, Washington has this internal mirror. He can look at himself. He knows he's the leader. He's the only one that could be president. Nobody else could do it. So he has to step up. April 7th, 1789, all 69 electors vote for Washington. At this point in time, Washington is revered by the bulk of the American citizenry, almost like he's a quasi-king, just with a different name, president. Washington continually rejects the idea of being king. In his inaugural address, he tells the crowd, I do not have heirs or immediate offspring and no family to build in greatness upon this country's ruin. I will not be king. So in his first term, his goals were to restore fiscal responsibility and create credibility for the new government. At this time, there are 4 million people in the United States. And Washington says, this new republic, I walk on untrodden ground. Patrick Henry claims during Washington's rise that the new Constitution is close to monarchy. And that's something Washington fought the whole time. Washington, the indispensable man, without him, the whole experiment that we're talking about might have failed. During this time, a large tumor appears on his thigh. It's removed by surgery. He gets the bad flu, lingers, almost dies. He's 57 years old. Thomas Jefferson says about Washington, that firm mind that we know Washington for has been remarkable, but it's starting to relax. A desire for tranquility has kept up on him. Ideologically, Madison and Jefferson don't want big government that Washington wants because Washington had to live it in the war. Madison and Jefferson start to veer away from Washington. Can you imagine how that must have felt? After election, Washington tours the South with his parade steed Prescott, whose hooves are painted every day before every appearance. He covered 2,000 miles. He links the glory of the war with the glory of the United States. he's assigned the role of the man who unites all hearts. And Washington says, this is his clear message: our hard-won independence will be short-lived unless the United States becomes a singular rather than a plural term. This is his dream team, and really it really is the dream team. James Madison, his liaison to Congress; Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State; Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasurer; Henry Knox, seasoned advisor; John Jay, first Chief of the Supreme Court; Edmund Randolph, his Attorney General. Remember, Washington operated the hub of the spoke. He delegated. He was a good manager. And with these people running things, he didn't have to manage much. He was more of a ceremonial figurehead trying to unify the country. Madison drafts 12 amendments to the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. 10 of the 12 go through. Does anybody know which ones didn't? There was, funny, the one that didn't was an amendment stopping Congress from raising its own salary. And also there was something regarding the quota of how many people per representative there had to be. But Washington just tells Madison, push them through. They're important. So Washington's actions, he creates the Supreme Court. His second act was to act on slavery. So slavery, real quick, Washington says, I want to emancipate the slaves, but James Madison, who is his liaison to Congress, says this is a tough call. It reminds me of the abortion battle, the Dodd's decision. Madison says, let's not do that right now. Let's let the states make their own laws on slavery. Washington, your goal is to unify the country. Don't take on this task of emancipating the slaves right now when we're just coming off a war. And we don't want to have another war right now. Washington's number one public priority was the creation of a unified nation. Trait number 8, Washington is a unifier. Trait number 7, I'm sorry. Third battle, Washington is working on fiscal responsibility. Hamilton creates the bank, the National Bank, which really agitated Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and caused them to form the Republican Party. I don't have time to talk about the Federalists and the Republicans tonight, but I put an article on the homepage of empoweryouamerica.com on the Federalists versus the Republicans, and a talk I gave on the War of 1812. If you're interested in those two parties, it's pretty interesting. You can just click on the link on empoweryouamerica.org. Madison comes up with the idea, in exchange for the feds paying all the states' Revolutionary War debt, will move the seat of America to Washington, D.C., the mouth of the Potomac, Rock Creek Park, close to Mount Vernon. George, you can be close to your home where you really want to be. And that is where Washington wanted to be. He wanted to be back at Mount Vernon. There was some work with the native tribes in Washington's first term. Many people think that was his biggest single failure. He tried to incorporate big reserves across the country. He just couldn't get it done. Washington had hoped he would be a 2-year caretaker, but he's been president for 4 years. He meets with Madison in the spring of 1792. He says, I need you to draft another person to be president. I cannot be president for a second term. Madison gets a hold of his cabinet. All the cabinet members tell him, no, it's you. You've got to be president for 4 more years. The only thing they could all agree on, Jefferson, Hamilton fighting with Madison, the only thing they could all agree on was Washington's indispensability. Jefferson and Hamilton, they hated each other. It really started to draw on Washington, and the Virginians were constantly bothering Washington also. And Washington just said, I am just sorry that Virginia should recognize that it has more to gain than lose by joining the nation. Washington rejects Jefferson and Madison leaving. And finally, Jefferson, at the age of 49 years old, says he plans to retire to Monticello. But he explains, Washington, you're 60, you cannot retire. Imagine that. Washington meets with his personal secretary, and says, find me another candidate to run. They couldn't do it. Washington's elected a second time. And this is going to be number 8, Candy, integrity. Washington says he's got a 2-paragraph speech. Wouldn't it be nice if Trump took a little bit of words of wisdom from that? He says, if I do anything wrong, you could hold me accountable, basically. He was a man of great integrity, and he actually worried about what the people thought of him. His second term begins. It's purgatory. It's a bad year for Washington. Yellow fever breaks out in Philadelphia. A tax on whiskey raises all sorts of commotion in the country. But Washington kind of insightfully says, I consider this insurrection on whiskey to be the first formidable fruit of democracy. Jefferson, and the interesting thing about that is that Washington is, when this whiskey rebellion came up, Washington actually gathers 13,000 troops, takes command of the troops, and it's the only time an American president has led troops in the field. Jefferson tells Madison, the one thing we don't want to see is Washington on a horse. That's gonna kill our new Republican movement. The Jay Treaty was something that caused all sorts of trouble in the country as war began to break out between Britain and France as Napoleon entered the scene. And I don't have time to go over it fully with you, but what I will tell you about the Jay Treaty was that all his cabinet was on different sides of it, and Washington made a decision to pass the treaty. That's number 9. He's a decision maker. The treaty took a toll on Washington. He really felt like he was getting old. In his farewell address, which was never delivered, he said, the first word in the term United States should be destined to trump the second word. Let's look at that one more time. The first word in the term United States should be destined to trump the second word. And that's number 10, Candy. Washington was a unifier. That's all he worried about, was trying to unify the country. And the one other one I forgot, you can mark it, number 10, was that he was a visionary. The one thing that Washington was insistent about, every decision he made was geared on having the United States not go to war for 20 years. He didn't feel the United States could incubate itself if it got placed in another war. And you know what? There wasn't another war for just about 20 years. Despite his creeping senility, he looked like he was still very much in charge. John Adams is sworn into office in a contentious battle with Thomas Jefferson. The two wouldn't speak for 11 years. Washington returns to Mount Vernon. He farms for 6 hours. At dinner, he collects his medals. He shows them to people who are visiting. He understands he's kind of public property. He studies, writes letters. And at that time, he had 123 horses, 600 cattle and sheep, and 300 slaves. Tensions with France. Napoleon talked about coming over to the United States so much that Adams talked to Washington about possibly leading the war efforts if they had to fight France. Secretary of War James McHenry visits Mount Vernon and asks Washington to be the new general, the old general at 66 years old. Washington goes out and orders new uniforms, the buff and blue uniforms you see right there. Washington is ready to go back to war. But Adams decides there will be no war. He gets away from the French, and Washington vows never again to allow himself to be drawn into decisions about the executive branch. Finally, Washington's will, a clear rejection of slavery. He writes these words, upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all slaves which I hold shall reserve freedom. I do hereby forbid the sale of any slave I may die possessing. I bet those words must have felt good to Washington. He gives equal shares of his holdings to 5 different relatives. December 12th, 1799, a storm develops, snow and sleet. Washington catches a cold. He reports shortness of breath. He's got a problem with his epiglottis. It closes and slowly strangles him to death. Washington says, Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to die. There are no ministers in the room, no prayers uttered, no Christian rituals. He dies December 14th with his secretary Lear and Martha at his side. His final words, "'Tis well." He was a hero of his age. No one else could have performed everything he did. He was a visionary. He only wanted America not to go to war again for the next 20 years and to become unified. He didn't have formal education, but he had this internal mirror which said, I'm not going to be Julius Caesar. I'm not going to be Napoleon. His own understanding said, a monarchy will not work in the United States. He was the country's hero, and most of his speeches talked about unifying the country. His eulogy at his funeral, the one you've probably heard from Henry Lee, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Calvin Coolidge probably said it best. Washington was the directing spirit, without which there would have been no independence, no union, no constitution, and no republic. We cannot yet estimate him. We can only indicate and thank the divine providence which kept him to serve and inspire his fellow man. So, I'm 1 minute late. I'm going to return you to the first question I asked you tonight. And the people online, we're going to throw a poll up there on Zoom tonight for all of you out there, and I want you to answer a yes-no question, which was the thesis that I opened the night with, and that is, did God's sovereignty, his absolute power, select George Washington and prepare him for the important task of helping birth and establish our great nation? Yes or no? Michael, is the poll going okay? Okay, so thank you. So everybody vote. We're going to wait a minute. And let's take a couple comments from the audience here on this question. I'm not going to keep you more than a couple minutes. Who has a thought about that they want to? Do we have a microphone? Bill, can we grab a mic? Can we grab a microphone? By the way, greetings to Betty, who's had a little work done, a little surgery, and we wish you well, Betty. Hope you're recovering, and sorry you couldn't be with us tonight. Can you guys give Betty a round of applause, everybody? Thank you. And let's take a couple comments before we give the final numbers. If you haven't voted yet, please vote. Go ahead. We got a couple comments. Leanne.
Well, what was George Washington's relationship with God?
It was said he didn't really believe in God. And when he died, there was no minister or anybody there, but enough people said to him that you were protected, that at times it seemed like he kind of actually believed it. Other thoughts? Right here? If you could speak in the microphone, please.
Well, thank you. So there's some risk there. And first of all, it can't be measured. That can never be answered.
No.
But there could be risk that if everyone believed that he was sovereign by God, that's like getting into divine right. And that could be, if everyone believed that could lead, back in the time, Washington, that could lead to monarchy and that the divine right.
Right. Right, and I will tell you, I'll add that. I mentioned this in one of the classes, that until 1943, it was taught in all grade 1 through 8 textbooks that, in fact, it was divine intervention. And that was taught to everybody. And that's what's happened since 1943 until 2026. Other thoughts? Who else has a thought on Washington? Anybody else have something they want to add? Right back here in the back.
Well, I think your personal beliefs probably play into this. I do believe in a God, and I think there were so many unusual things in the War of Independence, not just George Washington, but also like the escape from Brooklyn where this fog comes in, So my personal belief, is yes.
Thank you. Who else has a thought? Anybody else willing to dare to answer this question? Anybody? Okay. Well, Michael, what's the final percentage? 92% said yes, 8% no. And can I take, now, if you don't want to answer, you can just not put your hand up. Well, give me if you think yes, let's in the audience here, give me your hand. Okay. Interesting. Thank you. That's my presentation on George Washington.